A basic skill for every home coffee roaster is knowing when their coffee has finished the drying phase and begins the second phase, which is known as the browning phase or the Maillard phase. We're going to talk about that in a little more detail and why it's important to be able to master the drying phase. So stick around. All right, thank you for joining me today and welcome to the Virtual Coffee Lab. We're going to be taking a close look at the important elements of the drying phase that are going to help us have a successful roast. But first we need to understand what the dry phase is, and in simplest terms, it is from the beginning of the roasting process when we apply heat to the beans through to the end where the beans have gone from a green to a yellow state, and we call that dry end. That is the dry phase. There's two other phases after that. There's the browning phase, or some know it as the middle phase or the Maillard phase. And then the third, of course, is the development phase. But we're going to be focusing on this dry phase because it really is going to either make or break our roast. So let's take a look at these important elements of the dry phase and how we should master them. The first, of course, is charge temperature, or the starting point of our roast. And this is important because we have to determine a temperature to start at. For most of us, it's pre-warming our roasters, unless you're using an air system where you're literally just turning a switch on, and that's the beginning of your roast. But for those that have to pre-warm, we have to choose a temperature. And this is the rub. We have to choose the right temperature because we need to have enough momentum, enough heat, enough energy to push us through the dry phase, and then enough energy to help us move through the rest of the roast. If we have too much energy, if we have too high a charge temperature, if we've applied too much heat during the dry phase, then we risk roasting defects like tipping or scorching, and that will influence the taste of the cup. We don't want that to happen. We also risk an underdeveloped coffee because we're roasting the outside of the bean faster than the inside of the bean. And we want to be careful not to do that. And once we get through the dry phase, we may have so much energy that we can't slow the roast down where it's just going too fast through each of the remaining phases. We don't want that to happen. If we choose too low of a charge temperature, then we risk dragging the roast through each of the phases, pushing it with heat to try to get it through the phase because we didn't have enough heat to begin with, and we end up with a longer roast and, in many cases, a flat and boring cup of coffee that doesn't really have any really defining notes to it. And so we don't want that either. So the charge temperature is really important. For those who have the ability to monitor their temperatures with probes, we have an event called Turning Point. I've done this with the Hive coffee roaster. I have the digital dome, and that allows me to see the temperature of the beans. And I've used a meat thermometer that has an external probe that you can place in the beans. I use that with the popper so that you can at least monitor the temperature in the roasting environment. Even the Behmor has a roasting environment temperature that you can monitor. These things are all going to help you see where instead of the temperatures declining, the temperatures are now increasing. Now, that whole declining temperature thing is a little bit of a misnomer, especially if there is a bean probe that's measuring the bean temperature, because from the moment the beans go in the roaster, the temperature is always climbing. But what we're talking about is the temperature that is being relayed through the metal stick, that's the probe, that was really hot because of the temperature of the roaster, and now cooler temperature beans are touching that probe. And so there's that illusion of a downward temperature, but at one point it changes and it starts to move upward and continues to move upward, and that's what we call turning point. That event is going to help us understand if we have enough momentum to take us through our roast. After you've done enough roasts and you've watched that turning point, the temperature reading and the time that that takes place, that is going to be a pretty good measuring stick for you to know how much momentum you have, and really even estimating how long your dry phase might last. Those are all really important elements, real basic elements that give us ammunition to help us set up for a successful roast. All right, the next element that we can master during this dry phase is watching how our beans are responding to the heat that's being applied. If we notice that the beans are being very responsive and they seem to be yellowing quickly, then we are going to have to watch our heat and be very careful that we are not pushing this coffee too hard. If we find that the coffee is taking forever to go from a green to starting to pale or yellow, then we need to add more heat, introduce more heat, so that we aren't dragging our roast. So watching the bean color is an important clue, and during this dry phase, seeing the color change is a clue to how fast our roast is progressing. That's really important. That is a clue that a lot of us don't really consider. We just watch for the beans to change color and try to determine when that color has gone from a green to a yellow. Watch how long that takes. Watch turning point. Watch for the clues to see if your coffee color is changing quicker or slower during this dry phase, so that you can make some changes and save your roast or make a correction. All right, and that's my next point, is knowing when to call dry end based on color and or smell. Let's start with color, because we were just talking about bean color. We want to see our beans go from a dark green to a brighter green, and then to a pale green, and then we start to see yellow being introduced into the color, and then ultimately all of the green going away. This is the color progression that we are going to see take place during the dry phase. So this roast that I'm doing here in this video, you'll see the beans are kind of an olive color. As soon as they go into the roaster and they start being exposed to heat, it doesn't take that long, maybe a minute, minute and a half, and you're already going to see the color change. And in this example, you're going to see it go from a olive color to a kind of a brighter olive color, and almost to a little bit of a limey green color, so it's a little brighter. And then after that, you'll notice it starts to get dull, and some call it kind of this white appearance that takes place. And from the white, then that paling continues, and then the yellow begins. And we start to see a little more yellow and a little more yellow, and then ultimately we're at this point where I think the beans are yellow all the way through, but I'm not sure, or I'm not sure when I should determine that they're yellow or not. I can't see it very clearly. Make sure you have a flashlight and LED light to be able to see the beans clearly. No yellow light bulb tinges. Use an LED light to be able to see that. But look at this example here. I have, this is all within 10 or 15 seconds, I have beans that are yellow with a little bit of green left in them. And then I have, the next time I pull the trier, no green left in the beans. And it's that point that I call dry end. Now, others may call dry end at a different time. You may determine you're going to call dry end when most of the beans are yellow, or you're going to call dry end as soon as you start to see yellowing. I don't really know that many people that do that. Most people are trying to get it to where most of the beans are yellow and no green or very little green is left. For me, I'm looking for any green, and if I see it, then I don't call yellow yet. But I start checking really often so that I can get the exact moment that I call yellow or dry end. All right, the smell is also going to be another clue. The smell goes from a grassy smell to a kind of a hay smell, and then you get into kind of a starchy, yeasty smell. That is getting us pretty close towards the end of dry, actually very close. And then it'll start to get just a little bit sweet smelling, and we start to smell a little bit of a beginning of baked goods. And to me, that is a clue that we're right there at dry end. And your smells may vary, but use the smell as an indicator. Get to know what the smells are as you're approaching dry end. Get familiar with the smells so that you can recognize that smell and be pretty close. And that will just be another aid to help you determine when dry end is. All of these elements that I shared can be used together so that you can consistently call the end of dry phase at the same time every time. The time may be different based on the coffee, based on the energy inputs that you have, or the size of your beans, or the batch size of your coffee, but ultimately you'll be able to know exactly when to call the end of dry or dry end every time you're roasting coffee. And that's really important because it's going to help you set the mark your time to know how long you need the next phase to be, and then the development phase to be. That's really one of the purposes, or one of the primary purposes, of the drying phase and marking dry end, is knowing exactly when that phase ends so that you can know how long to roast in the second phase and then the development phase as well. I've got a whole video series on that. Take a look at my Coffee Roasting Essentials playlist. 3 tips for new home coffee roasters kind of gives an overview of that. And then I have a video on why the dry phase is important. The browning phase, which is the how to roast sweet and flavorful coffee. And then, of course, my video on the development phase. All of those are really important and will kind of give you the big picture of coffee roasting using the 3 phases of coffee roasting. And I hope that this video has been helpful for you guys. If you like what you've heard, hit the like button. Please subscribe to this channel. That helps me out a lot and encourages me to continue to bring you new content regularly. Have you had problems or difficulties trying to know when to call dry end? Have you had difficulty seeing your beans and knowing what color they are? Well, each of these elements is really important as part of mastering the drying phase. Ultimately, we need to know when the drying phase ends, and we need to mark it appropriately. So I would encourage you to journal your roasts, to track them, to document your times and your temperatures if you aren't doing that, and to know exactly when dry ends and you begin this next phase in your coffee roasting process. And you learn from that and you set yourself up so that you know how long to go through the browning phase and then ultimately the development phase. Do you have tips that may help other home coffee roasters know when to call dry end, or tips on how you're roasting your coffee during the dry phase that might be helpful to others? Please share those in the comments. I really appreciate you being here. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I hope you have a great week roasting. We'll see you next time.